Well, let's talk about the law that applies. What are Israel's obligations in terms of supplying humanitarian aid under international law?
Well, the context of this is critical. And of course, since 2007, Israel has provided a part of the electricity supply, water supply, and ordinary foodstuffs, humanitarian aid through the Kerem Shalom crossing from Israel into Gaza. And this has continued despite the Hamas aims of destroying Israeli infrastructure that supports these operations, and of course, carrying out its genocidal initiatives against the Jewish population. What we have seen is a cessation of this in the context of the war that Israel is fighting against Hamas. Certainly, there is no international legal obligation for Israel to provide any supply to Hamas. There isn't even an obligation under international law to provide, for Israel specifically, to provide humanitarian aid, although, of course, it has done precisely this, not just in the course of hostilities with Hamas terrorists, but in the course of the 7 years, since 2007, the 16 years that Hamas has controlled Gaza.
Mm.
Israel's only obligation is to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid by third parties, and this is a critical qualification, which is it seems always missed,
Mm.
where this aid will not be diverted to Hamas. That's plain under the Geneva Conventions. And of course, anyone who has followed the last 16 years of Hamas's control of Gaza know that that is impossible to guarantee. Nevertheless, in excess of its international obligations, Israel is, of course, facilitating the transfer of humanitarian aid from the Americans, from the British population, and international aid organizations also. And that is something that is set to continue. The difficulty here, putting aside the international obligations legally for a
Mm.
moment, is that, of course, Hamas has a documented history of diverting
Hmm.
these supplies and of using it to bolster its terror infrastructure. Reports now that water and fuel exists aplenty in some parts of Gaza, but it is being diverted by Hamas to facilitate its terror operations. And that is unfortunately the situation that we're seeing on the ground.
Exactly. There's not enough power to run generators in the hospitals in Gaza, but there's enough power to send rockets over into Israel. So clearly, Hamas is continuing to exploit international aid for terrorism. And Natasha, the ICC is investigating Israel for alleged war crimes. They claim they're independent and unbiased in their prosecution. What are your views?
Well, we saw a really shameful display from the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court yesterday, where he travelled to the Rafah crossing and sought to draw a moral equivalence between what we saw on the 7th of October, the atrocities that he called alleged war crimes, if you can believe it, by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations. Of course, we mustn't forget Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP members,
Hmm.
those affiliated with Fatah, the PLO, the so-called moderates in this equation were also involved in the massacre on the 7th of October and the continuing rocket fire from Gaza onto Israeli civilian communities. So unfortunately, for the first statement and the first press conference given by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the focus on supposed Israeli war crimes here is incredibly disturbing. It follows, unfortunately, a consistent practice that we have seen across international legal organizations, institutions, of attributing an evil intent to Israel that is
Yeah.
not borne out by the evidence. And it is on that basis that these allegations are made across the United Nations. We saw
Hmm.
similar shameful statements coming out of the UN Secretary General. Despite his attempts to backpedal that, the intent is plain from him
Yeah.
seeking to rationalize the attack.
Absolutely. These international bodies are completely appalling. I apologise for cutting you off, Natasha. We're out of time, but you have made so much sense. So thank you very much for joining us.